Adobe is a multi-billion-dollar software company, easily one of the most influential and among the most responsible for shaping the industry into what it is today, specifically when it comes to digital media creation. Adobe is the company behind Photoshop, Illustrator, and all these other iconic creative apps that currently combine for the majority of their revenue. Personally, I've used Photoshop and Premiere to create every video on this channel. Even if you don't do anything digitally creative, you have almost certainly encountered in some way. One thing that stands out to me is that Adobe created the PDF, the portable document format, all the way back in 1992. In fact, for about 4 decades now, I would argue that Adobe has been contributing important things to the world and should be respected for that, but I cannot overlook the fact that Adobe has been heavily criticized. I would argue it is among the most controversial companies out there. So in this video, I thought it might be meaningful to outline some of Adobe's bigger controversies over the years, starting off with the fact that many people believe that Adobe is simply too big. You know, when companies reach a certain size or capture too much of a specific market, reduce competition, and that can be a problem. Sometimes in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice feel the need to step in and try to prevent that from happening, and, well, that has been the case multiple times for Adobe. Like I already said, it is a multi-billion-dollar company with a valuation on the stock market above $200 billion. And that stock price has been utilized to acquire some major companies, some of which cost over $1 billion each. Just going through some of the more notable ones, Photoshop itself was technically an acquisition. It was created in the late 1980s by brothers Thomas and John Knoll, who licensed the product for distribution until 1995, when Adobe finally acquired the rights to it for $34 million. In 1994, Adobe bought Aldis Corporation, who is most known for the publishing software PageMaker, that has since been rebranded as Adobe PageMaker. Also, as part of that deal, they acquired a software called Freehand that was a competitor to their existing product, Adobe Illustrator. Many saw this as an attempt to reduce competition, so much so that the FTC made Adobe sell Freehand and banned them from buying any other comparable company for the next decade. Well, a little over a decade later, Adobe made a much larger acquisition when they bought Macromedia for $3.4 billion in stock. Macromedia was another large software company with over 1,200 employees and numerous products, including Freehand. Macromedia ended up being the owners of Freehand, and Adobe went ahead and bought them just as the ban had been lifted, and just a few years later, it led to a class action lawsuit, again claiming that Adobe was trying to cut out its competition and form a monopoly. A more recent example of this was in 2022, when Adobe announced that they would be paying. It would not only be Adobe's biggest acquisition, but one of the largest ever for a software company. Figma was known for its design platform for web and mobile apps, similar to Adobe XD, that was reportedly being favored among many Microsoft employees. Yet again, many people criticized Adobe for simply buying up a competitor instead of trying to beat them by improving their existing products. Well, that deal had trouble getting regulatory approval and was ultimately called off, with Adobe paying Figma a $1 billion termination fee. It ended up being a costly disaster for Adobe and gave the public further reason to criticize them for being too large and too controlling. Trust me, I can provide multiple examples along these lines, but right here I'm just trying to convey that Adobe has an extensive history of actions that have been criticized for being anti-competitive. The next source of controversy involves Flash. Now, you're going to have to forgive me on this one because it gets a little complex and I don't know enough about computers and technology to provide anything beyond a high-level explanation here. Flash was used primarily to create animations and games, among other things, in a compact way that made it easy and practical for web browsers. A lot of you probably remember that Flash was huge for a while. I know I spent countless hours playing those Flash games back in the day. Well, Flash was bought by Macromedia in 1996, who, if you remember from the previous section, was bought by Adobe in 2005. So that is where they took control of it. Right when that happened, they claimed that Flash was being used on more than 98% of PC's internet. But over time, that number has declined as Flash has been replaced with superior alternatives, mainly HTML5. At the end of 2020, Adobe ended support for Flash, effectively marking the end of it. Now I have it listed as a controversy because Flash developed a negative reputation for many users. I guess most notably, Apple refused to allow it on their mobile devices. And in 2010, Steve Jobs put out an open letter called Thoughts on Flash that criticized it for having bad security, using up too much battery, and he said that it was the #1 reason Macs crashed. I do want to point out that Apple and Adobe already had an extensive history together. I don't want to get too much into it, but Apple was Adobe's first major customer back in 1985 and even bought 19% of the company at the time. The relationship took a turn in the 1990s when Adobe refused to create special versions of some of its most popular software for Apple computers. iPhone, iPod or iPad, along with Steve Jobs' public criticisms of it, are generally believed to be major contributors to the demise of Flash and help make it such a controversial topic. Another source of controversy for Adobe has been cybersecurity. Like I said, Flash developed a negative reputation for having poor security, with Steve Jobs calling it out for having one of the worst security records in 2009. And other Adobe products like Reader have had security issues in the past, but the big one here is the infamous data breach that occurred in 2013. To this day, one of the biggest breaches of all time. The numbers seem to be a little unclear, but Adobe first announced that 2.9 million customer accounts had been compromised, but then later, after further investigation, announced that 38 million had been compromised, and that number has since been reported to be much higher. Hackers gained access to customers' personal information, a lot of it sensitive, like encrypted login data and credit card information. All of that in addition to information taken from the company itself, including portions of the source code for Photoshop. In 2015, Adobe agreed to pay about $1 million in a settlement connected to it. I don't think I have to point out that being the center of a massive data breach that gave hackers access to sensitive information about millions of their customers sparked a lot of criticism toward Adobe. The next controversy is probably the one that I have been most personally affected by, and that is Adobe's subscription model. That might not sound like something all that controversial, but trust me here. So Adobe is most known for their creative software, Photoshop, Illustrator, After Effects, and so many others, that they used to sell under a perpetual license as a bundle called Creative Suite, effectively meaning that you would pay for it once and have access to that specific version of it forever. Well, in 2011, they made a controversial decision by introducing Creative Cloud, a subscription service where you would only have access to the software while you are actively paying the subscription, not forever. The benefits of it being that it did make the software more accessible. If you committed to the full year, it was $600 split up into monthly payments of $50, as opposed to thousands of dollars for the perpetual license. Customers would always be up to date on the newest version of the software, and it made the company's revenue much more reliable and predictable. But of course, on the negative end, you never really own anything, and you are always paying that subscription price. When it was first announced, CNET helped conduct a survey with an analyst firm that revealed that 41% of people had a negative view of it, as opposed to 32% who had a positive view, and 62% had a negative view of that price point. Overall, there was a lot of backlash. Adobe responded to the survey by reminding customers that they didn't have to sign up for the subscription. They could still buy the Creative Suite like they had offered in the past, but then you might see where this is going. A couple years later, Adobe announced that the Creative Cloud subscription would be the only way to get access to the new versions of the software, which again was met with backlash. Today, Adobe has almost fully transitioned into the new model, with 94% of its revenue coming from subscriptions. It is over a decade later, and a lot of people still, I guess, aren't thrilled about being forced into the subscription model. They would rather just buy the software, but I guess it has just been accepted as the new standard, whether people like it or not. But then, In 2024, there's been a whole new set of controversies over it. The Justice Department has sued Adobe, claiming that they made it too difficult to cancel those subscriptions. If you commit to the full year and cancel before the year is over, there is an early termination fee of 50% of the remaining payments. Lawsuit. Adobe doesn't make that fee clear enough to the customer when they are originally signing up, and there are too many hurdles to jump through when trying to cancel it. Some of the customers even thought that they had cancelled it and continued to get charged for it. Again, these are all things alleged in the lawsuit, but it is reflective of real-life aggravation. I mean, that is one of the worst things, right? When you have to dedicate time and even money to cancelling a subscription to something that you're just trying to get rid of it and they are not letting you do it. Overall, switching over to subscriptions has had a positive financial impact on the company, but probably more of a negative impact when it comes to the customer's perception of it. My final source of controversy is another recent one, and that is their terms of service. In 2024, when Adobe updated their terms of service, they included some statements that were very general and used language that could be interpreted in various ways. In short, people were skeptical that Adobe was trying to use these new terms to claim ownership of their customers' work and access it to help train their generative AI. Obviously, this is only part of a much larger debate concerning these topics, so it is understandable why people were so concerned. Adobe responded by saying that it was a big misunderstanding, that they are simply accessing people's work to screen for illegal content and not for the reasons that were being feared. They updated their terms to be more straightforward about it, but many people were still left concerned. I guess a lot of it goes back to the first reason of how big and controlling they are. It made people realize just how reliant they are on Adobe for their careers in many cases. There seems to be a lack of competition happening. This terms of service incident brought that back, criticizing Adobe on multiple levels. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about all of these controversies? Which ones do you feel are justified and potentially concerning? And which ones do you feel have been exaggerated or blown out of proportion? I do want to be clear that these are not all of Adobe's controversies, but rather a trimmed down list of the categories that I feel best represent the overall criticisms toward the company. I think a lot of it is finding the right balance between what is best for the company and what is best for the consumers. There does seem to be conflicts there, so where does that balance lie? Also, are you an Adobe customer that uses Photoshop or any of the others? And what has been your experience with them? I want to know if it has been positive or aggravating or somewhere in the middle, and any other thoughts you have about Adobe, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.